I think without further ado, I will hand over to Jeremy, who really does need no introduction. Jeremy is our highly esteemed head of history of art at the British Institute of Florence, and he can give us the latest in his rather wonderful location reports from Florence. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Simon, and welcome everybody. This is my final contribution to the Wednesday Cultural Program for this summer before we close for August. I have been asked to return in the autumn in some form to continue this series, which appears to be very popular, looking at individual neighborhoods of the city of Florence. So carrying on with that theme today, I've chosen to spend some time with you taking a virtual meander through one of the historic districts of the center of Florence, known as the Sesto di San Piero Scheraggio. We'll talk about that name and where it comes from shortly, but just for us to get our bearings in the city and think about some of the things that we can look at today. This is the historic perimeter, let's say, of one of the historic districts of the city. That already in the 12th century had been organized into neighborhoods for the administrative functions of the Florentine commune. It's known as the Sesto di San Piero Scheraggio, often abbreviated to the Sesto di San Pier Scheraggio. And as you can see from this modern Google view, this is the neighborhood that corresponds roughly to the area between the Piazza della Repubblica and the Piazza Santa Croce, leading down to the north bank of the Arno River, between the bridges of the Ponte Vecchio and the Ponte alle Grazie. So this is not a large area of the city, but it is chock full of interesting historical places and things. I'd like to just sort of take you in no particular order into a few of the piazze, or the squares, that we have in this neighborhood, including the Piazza of the Mercato Nuovo, the Piazza della Signoria, the Piazza San Firenze, the Piazza Peruzzi, the Piazzale of the Uffizi, and the Lungarni, Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, and Diaz, which contains some important buildings, including the Palazzo Castellani and the Palazzo della Borsa, and one of my favorite sort of tucked away churches that we also have in this neighborhood, the Church of San Remigio. So we'll just sort of wander through in a way that corresponds roughly to how we would be able to most easily arrive to these places on foot. Before we get started looking at the particular piazze and monuments there, I just wanted to give you an explanation as to why I've chosen this sliver of the city. I'm sure most of us live in towns and cities that are organized into neighborhoods. The city of Florence today is currently divided into 5 quarters, which doesn't make much sense, obviously, if we think of quarters being 4 divisions of something. We've come up with 5 in modern times as the city has expanded, and so we still refer to these traditionally as quartiere, even though they would probably be more correctly referred to as quintieri, I guess. And you can see that the area that we are concerned with within the Centro Storico, or the historic center of the city of Florence, is contained entirely by the first district in the modern commune. For those of you who are joining us from Florence or from nearby towns, you'll know that it is based on these modern divisions of neighborhoods that we organize our trash collection and all these other sorts of things. You know, the kind of banal everyday administration of the city is facilitated by this division of neighborhoods. And we're going to be taking a look at how this tradition gets started in the city of Florence, following its expansion and development in the 12th century. Some of you might know, if you visited Florence or you live here, that we still have a enthusiastic living of, let's say, a neighborhood identity, which can perhaps most easily be seen embodied in the recently reinstituted traditions of calcio storico, or historic football, that you can see the space for here in the Piazza Santa Croce. For those of you who are unfamiliar with calcio storico, or historic football, this is a beloved local blood sport. resembling something of a combination of football, boxing, and rugby, in which the 4 historic Renaissance quarters or quartieri of the city are represented by teams. This is a 3-match knockout, basically, between the famous blues, greens, reds, and whites. And those teams represent the historic 4 quarters of the city before we added them to 5 that represent and are named by the principal churches, usually of those areas: Santo Spirito, Santa Maria Novella, San Giovanni, and Santa Croce. What I'm showing you here is a map of the same area of the city with the earlier divisions of Florence that were known not as quartieri, but as sestieri, literally sixths as opposed to quarters. And this is some of the history of the city that helps us understand why we have the modern districts today. This type of organization predates the final circuit of walls that was constructed in the late 1200s and early 1300s. So while we can see these historic neighborhoods going right up to the viali that surround the city of Florence today, we can see that they are in fact amalgamations of earlier districts, including the Borgo, San Pancrazio, Porta del Duomo, Porta San Piero, Oltrarno, and finally the neighborhood that concerns us today, the neighborhood of San Pier Scheraggio. These are neighborhoods that are essentially extended from the perimeters of earlier defensive walls into this larger footprint of the historic center in the 14th century. What you can see now under Sesti are basically the original dimensions of these neighborhoods. So it's within this, again, for time, what we have together. You know, I can't really talk about too much in 45 minutes. I've taken a very small corner to walk around together with you, at least virtually here in this Zoom meeting. This is how we believe the city of Florence would have appeared around the year 1175. And that is the year that the second important circuit of walls was constructed to incorporate newly established settlements outside of the original Roman walls of the ancient settlement. And I think we've talked about this also in earlier talks when we were looking at the neighborhoods of Santa Trinita and San Pancrazio, that these are sort of like the rings of a tree. We can sort of chart the growth of the city based on where we find these walls historically. Typically, we have roads that follow along their footprints today. And at the time that concerns us this evening, let's imagine that the Sestiere of San Pier Scheraggio was really defined by the easternmost extent of the city. And this corresponds more or less to the roads of the Via dei Benci and the Via Verdi that take us from the Ponte alle Grazie up to the Piazza of Santo Spirito. That was not built by 1175, so it's not represented on this map. What we can see is that the original ancient infrastructure left by the Roman founders of this city is gradually incorporated into a medieval commune, including many of the grandstands and ruins of monuments, such as theaters, amphitheaters, baths, and other public institutions. And we can still see many of those on the footprint of the Florentine map today, even if those ancient monuments are not necessarily still standing. To get an understanding of this neighborhood, I'll sort of go over to the other side first, and we can make our way back towards that easternmost limit. It's a nice place to get started to understand why we call this the Sesto of San Pier Scheraggio, and also appreciate some of the emblems and heraldic devices that are developed to represent this particular neighborhood of the city, by starting in the Piazza del Mercato Nuovo. And this is a beautiful 16th century loggia, which was constructed by Giovanni Battista del Tasso for Grand Duke Cosimo I. All right, and this is an extension of some of the economic activity that had been focused in the area of the Old Market, corresponding to the Piazza della Repubblica today. If you've been to Florence in recent years, you know that this is a very popular destination for people looking for souvenirs and leather bags and scarves. This is a great place to go and get some locally made Florentine artisanal goods. And it is also the home of course, the very famous Florentine resident, the porcellino that I'm showing you together in front of the wares of the vendors at the Mercato Nuovo today. You might remember that rubbing the snout of this bronze boar ensures one's return to Florence if they believe in those sorts of superstitions. And this is a great example of, let's say, how the art of the city really gives us an idea of identities and traditions that develop in modern times. That boar is actually a 21st century copy of a bronze sculpture that was cast by Pietro Tacca in the 17th century. And it was based itself on a Roman copy of a Greek original that we find in the antiquities collections of the Uffizi today. This is one of the sort of things that brings us back, let's say, to the historical periods of the city of Florence, and reminds us that the rulers of the city have for centuries been invested in the collection of antiquities and the promotion of the study of antiquity. What you have if you go into the market behind that boar, which again is so famous that it is celebrated by copies throughout the world, including this version that you can see outside of Sydney Hospital, as well as this version found in Sutton Place Park on Manhattan's east side, looking over the East River. If you were able to come back to Florence and sort of make your way into this busy market, you might be able to see the reason that the neighborhood takes as its heraldic device what looks like the wheel of a ship. This is actually a wheel of a cart that can be found, at least in a very subtle memory, by the inlay found in the center of this loggia. And the reason that we find this here is because this was the location long before Cosimo's loggia was constructed, where two important carts for the Florentine commune were held during times of peace. These were carts that held a war bell and a war standard known as the Martinella and the Carroccio Fiorentino. So anytime the Florentine militia had to go out of the city to defend its territory or conduct campaigns of expansion of that territory, these would have been the devices brought to identify those troops, as well as celebrate Florentine primacy in the area. We know about the history of these devices thanks to the writings of early chroniclers, including Giovanni Villani, whose commemorative sculpture can be found in one of the niches of the very same market. And he tells us, amongst other historical events, in his Cronica Nuova of Florence, written leading up to the arrival of the Black Death, that one of the most humiliating defeats of the Florentine military occurred in September of the year 1260 at a location just outside of the city gates of Siena, known as Monte Aperti, where Sienese troops were able to overcome Florentines and sort of drive them back further north into Chianti, into their own territory. What we can see here in a representation by Pacino da Buonaguida is a representation of that battle in which Florentine troops, identified here with the Giglio or the lily of the city, are proudly boasting the Carroccio standard as well as the Martinella war bell. We have even romantic sort of 19th century depictions of these historical events, which tend to link the standard almost the way that we would use flags today, right? When we look at the way flags are sort of posted over, areas of victory in terms of battle, that would have happened also in medieval Tuscany, as well as outside of Tuscany. Of course, we know that cities like Milan had a standard that was typically brought into battle. One of their sort of embarrassing moments is the capture of that standard by the troops of Cremona. So we've got these stories all over medieval Italy. I think that the reason we have the construction of a high Renaissance market on the spot is, again, to focus on the sort of economic activity of the duchy that Cosimo is in control of. But we also have little need for those sorts of objects as we move into that century, because of course Siena, the age-old rival of Florence, will come under the control of the Florentine state and join to it, forming the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in the second half of the 1500s. That fierce rivalry and campanilismo that we have between the cities and the people of Florence and Siena can perhaps be most easily appreciated today at the football stadium, where if you've ever had a chance to watch a match between AC Fiorentina and AC Siena, you might know that the Sienese fans are still calling out to the Florentines on the other side of the pitch, you know, to remember the Battle of Monte Aperti. So they're still talking about the Sienese victory from the year 1260. It remains very much a part of our modern lives and identities here in Tuscany. When we think about Cosimo's motivations for kind of wiping out that earlier association with this part of the city and constructing a loggia, again, we would expect these sorts of things from rulers who are trying to develop the economy and the infrastructure of their territory. And this market is, in one sense, kind of concealing a very important aspect of the Republican history of the city, and also promoting the benevolence and the success of the current Medici rulers. Of course, we don't have to walk too far from the piazza of the Mercato Nuovo to arrive to the center of political life. Since its construction in the late 1200s, the Palazzo Vecchio has been the headquarters of Florentine government right up until modern times. And of course, because this is an important area of the city in terms of its administration, artists from the Middle Ages throughout the 20th century have been commissioned to decorate areas of the square, the facades of the buildings, as well as the areas of the loggia that you can already see here in this photograph, with sculptures and statuary typically associated with ideas of rule and governance. So this area is already sort of moving into the bottom southeast corner of the original circuit of walls that were constructed by the Romans in the 1st century. And we know that that strange trapezoidal plan or footprint of the Palazzo Vecchio today coincides more or less with you know, this area of the city. You'll notice that just outside of the wall, which is represented here incidentally by a wonderful local illustrator, Massimo Tosi, what he has attempted to do here in this reconstruction is show us how some of the early Christian churches of the city were constructed just outside of those Roman walls. And in the case of this district, San Piero Scheraggio is named after one of these early churches. So of course, if we look at the square, we can appreciate, thanks to excavations that were carried out in the 20th century in the piazza, we understand better the layout of these ancient buildings. Part of the Roman theater was excavated and can actually now be visited as part of the percorsi of the museum contained within the city hall. We know that we've got all this antiquity beneath our city. It's not as visible as it might be in cities like Rome, the imperial capital, or excavated cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum, but we would have had many of the same structures here in ancient Florencia. And when we think about the sort of rise of this commune and their prestige, of course, it will be thanks to good government that we can sort of enjoy this prosperity of the city. It's for this reason that the square around City Hall is one of the finest open-air sculpture gardens that we have in Europe, which really encompasses, you know, sort of the major figures of Florentine sculpture from the 15th through 16th centuries. We're not going to get into any of these really today, but you know, this is what you can come and see in Florence without buying a museum ticket or queuing up, you know, outside of an admissions office. These are things that we have basically right out there in the squares, so you could teach a pretty solid 2 centuries of Florentine sculpture simply with the material that survives, you know, in the Piazza della Signoria today. If we were to go slightly outside of this neighborhood to the Church of Santa Trinita, closer to my home where I'm joining you from today, in the Church of Santa Trinita, there's an important family chapel that was decorated by the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio with frescoes depicting scenes of the life of St. Francis for the head of that family at the end of the 1400s, an associate of the Medici Bank known as Francesco Sassetti. And what we have in the uppermost area of the back wall of these frescoes is a representation of the Piazza della Signoria as it would have appeared before the installation of many of those sculptures. So it's a bit hard to see here, but you can make out the facade of the Palazzo Vecchio together with the ringhiera or rostrum, which was the elevated platform from which important communications were delivered to the Florentine citizenry assembled in the square. We can also see that the Loggia of Orcagna is essentially empty at this point. That sort of population with figurative sculptures is going to take place a little bit later. But what we can also notice in this representation left to us by Ghirlandaio is the fact that the Uffizi that we would expect to see peeking out here between the Palazzo Vecchio and the Loggia of Orcagna, or the Loggia de Lanzi, is omitted, and that is of course because it is not there yet. So it would be just around the corner of the Palazzo Vecchio that at this time we still would have been able to go and visit the church of San Piero Scheraggio, after which this historical cestiere was named. There will be friars operating a priory here in this church right up until the 1560s, when the construction of the Uffizi begins. And in fact, many areas of at least the church, the Basilica Church of this complex, were in part preserved in the constructions of Vasari. And walking down the Via della Nina, which is the small street that you can take to walk between the Uffizi and the Palazzo Vecchio, you can find a plaque which records the existence of this church. It literally says that this is where the remains and vestiges of this ancient church can be found. And one of the best views offered to understand the sort of survival of this building is offered by the upper floors at Palazzo Vecchio. Looking here into those buildings which are constructed just beyond the facade of the Uffizi, we can still see the stone masonry and roof line of that original church. So it's been sort of absorbed into a larger construction. But it would be for this reason, basically, that this entire area was known and still referred to traditionally in more modern centuries as the neighborhood of Piero Scheraggio. So this is something that we have not just in Florence, but also in other cities. You know, we still refer to things that haven't been around for centuries, but because they've become ingrained in Florentine memory, we still refer to these things even if they no longer technically exist. Of course, we will sacrifice that early Christian church for the design and construction of the Uffici or Uffizi, which are the extension of administrative offices required now off of Palazzo Vecchio following the acquisition of Siena. This is based on the designs of Giorgio Vasari, Cosimo's very important court architect and advisor. And of course, it's here that we have not only one of the most important paintings collection in Italy in the upper floors of this building, we also have important state offices, and like many of these buildings, the architecture and the external sculptural decorations are worth a visit even if you are unable to enter into the building. So here we can see some of the portrait sculpture of Cosimo together with allegorical figures inspired certainly by Michelangelo's work in the new sacristy of San Lorenzo here in Florence, representing the qualities of this ruler, in this case, rigor and equity. You can sort of walk around and poke your way into these different niches and look up at the elevations and enjoy these sculptures. Also on the side that faces into the river, into the Arno River, where we can see perhaps better the large windows that provide all that wonderful light for certain spaces of the Uffizi, and of course those views out into the south side of the river. It would be from this area of the museum that we would begin basically an excursion into the Vasari corridor, which was constructed around the same time in order to connect those administrative palaces to the seat of courtly life over at Palazzo Pitti. We're not going to go over there because I think we talked about this neighborhood already in a previous talk, but this is just one part of Vasari's tireless work here in the city of Florence, modernizing it now for the facility of Cosimo's government and the governments of his descendants. What we have next to the Uffizi on the Lungarno Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici is perhaps one of the most ancient structures that still commands a view over the north bank of the Arno River, and that is the Palazzo Castellani, which was already recorded by writers such as Dante, who would have referred to this building at the time as the Castello d'Altafronte. It's later inhabited by the Castellani family of Florence, and in modern times is converted into the Museum of the History of Science. There was a very important renovation of this collection that had been sort of formed and sort of installed in this building in the 1930s. following the lead up to the year 2000, which is the 400th anniversary of the publication of Galileo's Starry Messenger, the plan is to basically revamp this museum, modernize it, and reopen it in honor of Galileo. So the historic Museo della Storia della Scienza is actually now referred to today in Florence as the Museo Galileo. It's another extraordinary collection here in Florence, charting the participation and role of Medici rulers and scientists in the age of science and exploration. Next to it, we have, seeming a bit out of place, an early 19th century building, which is constructed basically to house the Chamber of Commerce of the Florentine state. This will later be sort of given over to the newly formed Kingdom of Italy, whose capital will be located here in Florence for a stint. This is a building known today as the Palazzo della Borsa, or the Camera di Commercio. It is based on the designs of a Florentine architect known as Michelangelo Maiorfi, and later enlarged by Emilio de Fabris, who is the architect that provides us not only the tribune of Michelangelo's David at the Accademia, but also the neo-Gothic facade of the Florentine Cathedral. It is standing on the footprint of an earlier building that I'm sort of sorry to say is no longer there. This strange looking structure that you can see represented in this watercolor is a representation of the Tettoio, which was basically a large building used not only for the dyeing and drying of textiles, it was also sort of a customs port for the Porto Fluviale, basically the river port that would have been located here historically. Some of the ramps that were constructed to access this building can still be seen today in the walls leading down to the Canottieri, or the Row Club, just below these buildings on the north bank of the river. If we were to move our way away from the river and maybe back up into the area of the Bargello, sort of making our way back towards the cathedral, we can find another interesting building whose period of history really kind of encompasses lots of different Florentine things. This is known today as the Church of San Filippo Neri. It was constructed in the 17th century in order to provide space for the administrators of an oratory that had already been constructed basically in the Middle Ages. Basically, it was known as San Lorenzo, and it's for this reason that the square is still known as the Piazza San Firenze. In the 17th century, it's going to be enlarged, rededicated to San Filippo Neri. And this building today is no longer a church. It's been deconsecrated following the suppression of those orders, but what we had for a time were some of the Florentine law courts, and most recently in 2017, the arrival and opening of the Fondazione and Museo Zeffirelli, dedicated to the extraordinary career of Florence's own Franco Zeffirelli, a cinematic and theatrical director. So this is one of the sort of new museums that we have to boast in the city. It's an excellent state-of-the-art display of that figure's work and life. I'm sure many of you have heard at least of some of his films, including Tea with Mussolini, a couple of screenshots you can see here. But he really started off in the theater, and this collection offers a great way to sort of understand that moment of his career and his life. There are costumes and drawings and designs for productions going all the way back to the 50s and the 60s, as well as installations that attempt to reconstruct some of his projects that were never able to be completed. If we make our way out of that Piazza San Firenze and sort of stroll down the Borgo dei Greci, or the Via dei Neri, within a couple of turns, we can arrive to the small church of San Remigio. This is one of the sort of off the beaten path. I know it sounds strange to say that when we're here really in the heart of the city, but this would have been one of those buildings that never really had lots of art preserved in it up until modern times. So it's still sort of a church. You don't have a museum inside necessarily. But this is a great part of the city and its history, because it will be into this church that the priors of San Scheraggio are relocated in 1563, following the beginning of the construction of the Uffizi. So we didn't just, sort of evict those priests and priors, that we actually sort of arranged for them to operate now out of another building, and that is this one. In the 20th century, like many of these structures, There was an attempt to restore a medieval appearance to its interior. We know that there were decorations in the interior from the 1700s and 1800s that had really obscured this kind of medieval feeling going inside of the church. That has since been restored, and you can sort of enter into the space now when the doors are open to take a look at some of the frescoes that survive in the vaults of the central nave. And we also have important paintings in Florentine collections that are at least historically associated with this church. One of my favorites is actually the small altarpiece that you can see in the Uffizi, attributed to an artist active here in Florence in the period just after the Black Death, referred to as Giottino or Giottino di Stefano. This artist's name was Tommaso di Stefano. He was the son of Stefano da Firenze, who we know was a pupil of Giotto himself in the years before the plague. And so he's referred to already in his own time as Giottino or Little Giotto because he had received, basically through one degree of separation in the form of his father, the instruction of the workshop or the bodega of Giotto. And so because he's able to work in this manner that is so evocative of the earlier master, he sort of is given this nickname of a mini Giotto or a Giottino. And this is a work that we know was located originally on the rood screen of the church of San Remigio, and it was produced in those years following the devastation left in Florence by the Black Death. And we can see a lamentation, a scene which depicts the witnesses of Christ's crucifixion lamenting that loss over his dead body following its removal from the cross. You can see that those historic individuals, such as the Virgin Mother and Mary Magdalene, are joined by anachronistic figures, including San Remigio. We know that this church was originally constructed in the 11th century alongside a hospital which was devoted to French pilgrims making their way down to Rome along the Via Francigena. San Remigio was an historical bishop of Rheims in France, and so it's for this reason that we have a cult following beginning there with churches constructed here in Italy. We can also see Saint Benedict together with that saint looking over two figures who are represented in a smaller scale. We believe these to be the donors. One appears to be a woman who has taken sort of the habit and the clothes of a nun, and the other seems to be a younger woman of marriageable age. The donors, or at least the identity of the donors, has yet to be identified, but we hypothesize that this is an early example of female patronage of a religious work of art at a time where, in the wake of the Black Death, perhaps this sort of activity being taken on behalf of women is made more accessible and acceptable by the very different population that we find here in Florence during this period of recovery. So it's been suggested that what we are looking at is actually the widow mother of this young woman. It was common for women who survived or outlived their husbands to take vows and enter into religious orders. And it looks like she is there together with the surviving daughter of the family, showing their remaining surviving members of the family as the donors or sponsors of this work. So it's a sort of a grim work of art, contemplating the passion of Christ, but one that really helps us get right back into the sort of psychology of Florence and Florentine art in that time. In fact, we notice such distinctive characteristics of the art produced in these decades in the second half of the 14th century that it has its own sort of stylistic term. We can refer to this as an example of post-Black Death art. I'm going to end with a neighborhood which I find also particularly interesting because it just gives us a sort of a multi-layered kind of idea of the history of the city, and that is the area of the Via Torta, Cake Street, making our way just into the edges of the Piazza Santa Croce, as well as the piazza that we can find on its southern perimeter, which is known today as the Piazza Peruzzi, named after an important Florentine family who, together with other banking families like the Bardi and the Albizzi, helped to grow the Florentine banking industry in the years leading up to the Black Death. This is one of the strange sort of areas to look at on the map because it's one of the only sort of oval-shaped sort of streets that we have. And the reason for this particular shape has to do with the ancient history of the city. So we know, for example, that the Peruzzi, who had constructed early tower houses and later purchased other buildings and began to form almost sort of a family complex of various buildings, in the center of which was this piazza, almost serving as sort of a private courtyard for the family. We think of this as the neighborhood of the Peruzzi today, and that is because, again, they're one of the early families in this neighborhood to begin constructing residences not only outside of this strange oval street, but also within the ruins, which give us the understanding for this area of the city, the freestanding amphitheater. So Florence had not only a theater, it also had an oval amphitheater like what we find surviving in the form of the Colosseum in Rome today, or some of the other standing amphitheaters such as the Arena at Verona. What you can see here is an old map, and I know that it looks like we've got cafes everywhere here in Florence back in the Renaissance. These are not cafes. Those look like bars everywhere on this map. That is an esse lunga, just like what we have in early typesetting in English. This is a replacement for a double S or something like that. So basically we're seeing case. We have residences basically in these city blocks, as well as the spaces that would have originally been the interior arena floor of this amphitheater. And even going to, you know, some of the other examples of these sorts of theaters, we know that this was very common in the Middle Ages to use whatever standing Roman architecture had sort of survived, you know, as the grandstands for residences of important ruling families. Perhaps the families of Florence are following even earlier examples of important Roman clans, including the Fabi, the Pierleoni. We know that by the time we get to the Renaissance, the buildings that we find today, constructed on top of the remains of the Theater of Marcellus in Rome, come into the possession of the Orsini family. So, you know, perhaps this is also a way to sort of show the prestige of these families by really seeking out these ancient ruins and using them, let's say, for the construction of these palaces. We find that boasted by the families of this neighborhood, that they are living within the shell, or the shadow at least, of this great example of Florence's Roman past. If we take a look at the famous Bonsignori map, which was constructed at the end of the 1500s, we can see that area of the city as well. And it reminds us that not only do we have this sort of, you know, patchwork, let's say, of different tower houses and palaces within that area of the former Roman amphitheater, we also have the command of this neighborhood instituted by the Peruzzi family. So together with their towers, there was actually one of the surviving gates of that original wall constructed in 1175 that would have provided access to this piazza, and we still refer to the location of that gate and the arch or vault that we find in its place as the arco or the volto of the Peruzzi family. I think there's a sushi bar inside of this arch today. So again, all things kind of carry on into modern times, and hopefully that sushi bar is back open again. But even walking through a very small area of town, you can start to get a sense of the Roman, medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, and modern history of the city. It is a great way to sort of think about some of the artists or buildings that you may have encountered in readings or studying the art of Italy from outside. I hope that everyone is able to return to Florence soon, and if you are in Florence, we do now have the green light officially to go back into some of these squares. So for those of you who are nearby, I would encourage you, maybe not today with these rainstorms, but when the nice weather comes back, to come and explore this neighborhood. It really does have a lot to offer. So I think that that's probably a good point to conclude our virtual meander of the Sesto of San Pier Scheraggio. And I will just take one last opportunity before opening the floor to questions to remind you that the final art history seminar devoted to artists working in Florence and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany in the 17th century will begin on Monday. We have timetables at 9 a.m., 3 p.m., and 6 p.m. local time that we invite you to join, to register for. and that can all be found on our website as well as in the weekly mailouts. This will be the final art history seminar of the summer before we close for August, and we look forward to coming back not only with new seminars in September, but also new contributions to the Wednesday Cultural Program. So thank you for your attention. I'm hoping you've enjoyed this brief visit into Florence. And Simon, thanks again for putting this great series together. I'll stop sharing now to see if we've got any questions or comments.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask you one question, because I half know the answer, but I'd like the whole answer. You rightly point out that the Piazza della Signoria is an extraordinary open-air gallery of great Renaissance sculpture. How many of them are actually originals? Because I know most of them are copies. Are there any originals still there?
A good number of them are still original. The David of Michelangelo, which was installed in that square in 1504, was replaced with a copy in the 1870s. And I believe that by the time we make our way to the 1880s, a lot of the copies of the earlier Donatellos are being made. So the Judith beheading Holofernes of Donatello, as well as the Marzocco Lion of Donatello, are copies, together with Michelangelo's David. The rest are still the originals. So if you're looking for Aminati or Bandinelli or Giambologna or Cellini, you know, those are still the originals out there in the square. There's been talk recently about removing some of the more fragile works from the loggia simply because it is very difficult to ensure their protection out there. And so I guess the Sabine group of Giambologna has been kind of the focus of this idea of maybe moving that into the Uffizi, perhaps in the nave of San Pier Scheraggio, to be replaced with a copy. But for now, at least, I would say about 80% of what you've got out there is still the original art.
Extraordinary. Okay, anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment, usual protocol, unmute yourself, have your say, and then if you can remember to mute yourself again afterwards, that would be great. Who's going to go first? I've got another one. Whilst people are thinking of questions. Meaning of Scheraggio.
They're going to try to get me here.
Yeah, what's the meaning of Scheraggio?
I'm not really sure. I think it's just the distinction of a saint as distinct from St. Peter,
yeah.
First figure of Christ. We've got a couple of San Pieros, San Pietros.
So maybe it's just his second name, his cognome. Yeah.
If anyone knows that, please put that into the chat. But I've never come across a sort of an obvious explanation as to the identity of the saint for which the church was named. Sounds like scarafaggio in Italian, so I whenever I see that word in text, I always think of cockroaches or beetles, scarabs, these sorts of things. Scheraggio.
Any more.
Oh, hello. Could I ask a question?
Please.
I read just recently that in the Piazza della Signoria, where the loggia is located, a building was demolished in order to build the loggia, and that building was the Mint, and the Mint was moved to one of the towers for the gates, where it remained for many years, and that there was a corridor under that tower, under the river, that ran across to the Tower of San Niccolo. You know, I just wondered if you had any comments on that, if that was correct.
It is correct. The Mint, which is known in Italian as the Zecca, was historically located close to the city hall, and again, following the development of that part of town, it was moved to the southeast corner of the final circuit of walls left by Arnolfo. So there's actually a freestanding tower that we have in the middle of kind of an intersection of the Viali and the Lungarni, in which this tower still stands. It's known as the Torre della Zecca, or the Tower of the Mint. And more or less at that height of the Arno River, close by, is a weir, which slightly changes the level of the river as it makes its way closer to the bridges of the center. And it's within that weir that a subfluvial passageway was constructed. Okay. So yes, there is. It's not urban legend. There is actually a passageway below the river.
No, thank you.
Barbara, yes, please.
Hi, I'd like to do a shout out to Simon and Jeremy from San Diego, from the country not allowed into Italy. As you both know, I've taken many months worth of classes and lectures from the British Institute. I have a Lufthansa ticket on my desk that says I was supposed to be there the last 2 months. So for you both to have initiated, and as I understand, to continue online offerings is such a blessing. I get to feel like I am still there. I get to keep up with brain power and visuals. And I just thank you both so very much. Thank you.
That's very kind of you, Barbara. We miss you all. And I see many faces here from our courses, from our events in the library. And it is not easy. I hope, Simon, that you don't mind speaking for the both of us. It hasn't been easy to sort of re-strategize and how to continue with our cultural mission, but we're really doing this for you. I mean, we empathize with you. We want to have you back here as quickly as possible. And if we can spirits up by joining all together like this over Zoom, we are most certainly happy to continue into the autumn or for however long that takes to make sure that you don't lose your connections to Florence and its community.
Yeah, I just add two things. I mean, first of all, I think it's beyond the autumn. I think for us at the Institute, a little silver lining to this dark, dark cloud has been to discover how we can operate effectively online and reach out to you guys, the global community of people who love Florence, connect with Florence, and by extension have an affection for the Institute. And that's connecting strongly with something that I'm developing right now with the leaders of the city. I'm talking to the Sindaco Nadella and his team, leaders of Florence, how we, the Institute, can contribute to the difficult but important job of reconstructing the Florentine economy. Because though for us living here, it's of course a unique and strange, rather wonderful time to be able to live and wander in our city without the crowds. The economic impact of losing tourism almost completely for several months, and actually international tourism for many months. We don't expect to have many international tourists before next year. This is devastating to the city. The city government is essentially bankrupt already. And there's an awful lot of people whose livelihood depend on the international aspects of Florence. So our contribution to assisting the reconstruction of the local economy, which the great minds are thinking about and working on as we speak, is to convene you people and others who are the internationals who live in Florence, visit Florence, live around the world and have an affection for Florence, so that a mixture of brain power and affection and love, and hey, a little bit of money along the way helps, can make a serious contribution to the reconstruction of the city. So that's why 2 weeks ago we trialed our Florences in our seminar, which has reached an audience, found a new audience, and found a lot of favor in the city. And I'm actively working now with a number of players to launch this as a strand of our activity starting in September, running through the autumn and winter, to sit alongside our traditional role for the history and art of Florence, to look also at how we, the international community, resident and non-resident, can participate in building a better future for Florence out of the ruins of the current crisis. So I'm sorry if that was a bit of a statement. Any more thoughts about Jeremy's lecture, about what we're doing at the Institute, about Florence, about life? We've got a couple more minutes if somebody wants to contribute.
According to the internet, Scheraggio means a ditch, and it was the ditch outside the old city wall.
Perfect.
Thank you, Graham. That's now we've all learned something new. Yeah, because actually that shows in your early map, doesn't it, Jeremy, that the Sesto sits right alongside that ditch that was there.
And you know, we know that historically, when we see those churches kind of popping up in the you know, in the outer limits, it's a real estate issue, right? I mean, these aren't emperors or kings coming in to build a church. These are orders who are, you know, relying typically on alms and these sorts of things, at least as we get into kind of the mendicants a bit later. So we normally find the history of these areas being something that's kind of backwater, something on the other side of the moat or on the other side of the ditch. So that makes perfect sense. You know, we still have lots of other streets like the Via dei Fossi, you know, the road of the gutters, which gives us an idea that that was sort of outside of a wall at one point. So makes sense.
Any more for any more?
Could I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Please do.
Yeah, there used to be a palio through this area of Florence, okay? And it went from Ponte alle Mosse to Piazza San Firenze, and to the annoyance of Vasari, Sodoma won, to the pleasure of the Sienese. Could you tell us more about that?
The Palio of Florence. Palio is a word that we have in Italian to describe an historic horse race, as well as the banner for which the races were won. It's typically a standard, which is given to the rider, or in some cases, the horse without the rider, that represents administrative districts. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Palio of Siena, in which the contrade of the city of Siena compete against one another for the palio. Pallium is the Latin word for banner or flag. So it's the race and the prize. In many many Italian communes had these sorts of rituals. They tend to mark the point of the calendar in which the patron saint is honored through feast days. I think that there was also a palio in Arezzo for a while, where they'd sort of retrace the sort of ancient walls of the city of Arretium. In Florence, it was a course, it wasn't a circuit, you're correct. It started sort of out by the Prato and kind of came into the city. And that was typically run on the day of Saint John the Baptist, or maybe on the day of the Vigil, either the 23rd or the 24th of June. Going back, interestingly, the Zecca, the mint of the city, was the institution that usually financed the production of the Palio of Florence. So this extraordinary sort of banner that would have to be touched by the first rider to sort of complete the course was produced at no sparing of expense. These were woven banners with precious metal like silver and gold into them, and we have some scraps surviving of some of them. So it would have been something that wasn't exclusive to Siena or Florence. We have different sorts of embodiments of horse races. They tend to be in honor of the patron saint of the city, and they also tend to harken back, let's say, to the ancient foundations, the Roman foundations of those cities.
Okay, thanks.
And yes, it was to the chagrin of Florentines that Il Sodoma was able to actually win. I forget what race it was.
With a monkey on the back of the horse.
That wasn't well received at all. Imagine that they felt better for themselves the following day, because the other major event that you have in the center, at least in the streets and the squares of Florence at the time of the feast day of St. John the Baptist, is the Festa degli Omaggi, or the Festival of Oblations. And that is when all of the subject communes of Florence have to come in from the territories to present gifts symbolically to St. John the Baptist. They're really being offered to the government in terms of a symbol of their subservience. And following the acquisition of Siena, it's one of the most humiliating things for the city of Siena. Every year in June, they have to send an ambassador into the Florentine state.
The palio was St. Barnabas. The palio was on the day of St. Barnabas. Yeah. And Sodoma was from Vercelli, even though the Sienese claimed him as their own because they liked him so much, and he won in Florence.
He was active already at that point in Siena for a while, so he was sort of grouped with them. But basically, just going back, the offering of Siena to Florence at that time was a silver lupa, a she-wolf usually, which has been part of their heraldic imagery. So I don't know if that gets started before or after Sienese start winning races. But they do have to come in every year and give a very sort of humiliating kind of offering to the Grand Dukes at that point to show their subservience to the Florentine state.
Thank you.
They don't still do that, I don't suppose.
They no, all of those carts were for the most part kind of demolished in the early 1800s. There was another cart that was made, you know, by the Zecca, by the Mint as well, which had San Giovanni up on top, and that was a later replacement for a live actor. They used to call him the Finto Santo, the fake saint. So every year a Florentine would get to dress up as St. John the Baptist and sort of go on top of this cart in the parade procession and sort of throw candies down to the children and all these sorts of things. So there's lots of wonderful, you know, sort of documents that record the sort of festivities and the rituals of the people of Florence in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Richard Trexler is a great scholar to look at. He's looked very closely at sort of, you know, how Florentine identity is formed through ritual. Public Life in Renaissance Florence, I think, has an entire chapter devoted to the festivities of the feast day of St. John the Baptist.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, we're towards the top of the hour. We can go on for a few minutes if people have got some other thoughts or questions. Last call for contributions. If not, Jeremy will see some of you on Monday for the Seicento. And we hope to see most all of you and your friends for the very last in the series next week, Jason Markles on the American sculptors in Florence. Please don't forget to put in your €10 if you'd like to, and also to fill out our survey if you haven't already done it. Thanks all for tuning in from all over the world. Lovely to see you all again, and we'll see you all again next week. Okay, good night all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.